All marketers want to be data-driven. That is, when we looked at the findings, no mystery here, 91% of marketers believe that brands need customer data. I think hopefully all of us would agree with that. In fact, to me, the mystery is the 9%. I don't know who they might have been. Incidentally, this was true across industries. In fact, the lowest score on this one was 83%. This was across industries. But here's the problem. The data they're collecting are not what they need, are not collected timely enough. 29% said they had too little data. 36% they had too much. Another 50% said they couldn't make it actionable. So there's a real point here we'll come back to later. They're collecting data, many companies are, but it's not apparently what they think they need to make the decisions they want to make. Obviously, it was better for traditional decisions, like traditional media decisions, where demographics were key, but especially when it came to things like social media, as you might guess, the results were very anemic in terms of people having measures, at least that they could rely on to make their decisions. Let me ask you a question. Sharing data in your company. I'll show you the results in just a moment, but in terms of sharing data, is that a barrier in your company? If you think it's a barrier in your company or a problem, just raise your hand. I'm curious. Anybody think it's a barrier, sharing data across divisions, across sales and marketing? Well, you did better than our sample does. Our sample thought, in fact, 51% actually thought this was a real problem. That in fact, in their companies, they had difficulty sharing data. So even if the customer service people had data, or the marketing people had data, or the public relations people had data, it was not effectively shared. Interestingly enough, if you were VP or below, more than 50% thought this was a problem. The CEOs, however, only 30% roughly thought it was a problem. So apparently, the further you're away from the trenches, perhaps, the less of a problem it is. Big data, then in short, may be too big or too little, but at least what we found was that people were not satisfied with what they had. Digital tools. I said we're going to go through this fairly quickly, but we'll give you some idea, and you can, as I said, see the whole report later. Everybody's using it. 85% across the board were using brand accounts of some sort, Facebook, Twitter, Foursquare, whatever, with their marketing plans. Even B2B was 78%. So very, very high percentages, at least I thought so, in terms of people using this. No industry was below 70% on this question. On the other hand, in terms of measuring, only 14% said they had any measures that they thought would be effective for them, especially with respect to financial impact. When you looked at something like mobile advertising, it was about 17%, so you get the idea. Not only was having metrics a problem here, but also a problem was comparing the metrics. One of the issues, of course, when you're dealing with all sorts of media is trying to come up with some metric you might be able to use across the board. 70% of CMOs said this was a major goal, but the problem, of course, is that many of these channels have channel-specific metrics. For example, Twitter tweets, likes, shares, and Facebook, and so forth. And so this exacerbates the problem, makes it even more difficult. So at the end of this storyline, again, we found that there was still a lot to do in terms of coming up with effective metrics. I don't think I'm surprising anybody in this room, but nonetheless is what we found as of 10 days ago. Finally, the area that I'm doing a fair amount of work with is ROI. And in particular, all marketers believe that they should be measuring marketing ROI, but in part because they feel they're under scrutiny. How many of you feel you're under more scrutiny? Well, you're a lucky group here. I see a few hands out there. 70% we found felt the scrutiny. And the consequence of that was they felt they needed to come up with some measures. On the other hand, they didn't have them in many cases. 22% we found used brand awareness alone. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands on this one, to make their marketing decisions. And you might say, what's wrong with that? Well, what's wrong with that is brand awareness by itself is a trailing indicator of your brand strength. It's the last thing you lose. In other words, you really have to use brand awareness coupled with something like brand preference or brand attributes. For example, TWA, shortly before they went bankrupt, they had very high brand awareness. And what people were saying was, we know you and we don't like you. So the point is that you need to have something a little bit more complicated than that. Of course, brand awareness would be better than the 7% we found who weren't using any metrics at all for their decisions. They were just going with the flow on those. In terms of budgeting, we still found that more than up to 70% of people were using, in part at least, historical budgeting, historical spending to set their budgets. In other words, looking in the rearview mirror at what we did last year. Who was satisfied with their ability to measure marketing ROI? Let me try one last question with you. How many of you are satisfied, and maybe a lot of you are satisfied with your ability to measure marketing ROI in your organization? Okay, our sample was pretty good on this one. We had 45% across the board, which in my experience with other studies is very, very high. Some of the studies I've done with the ANA and the Conference Board, those studies I've been involved in, the percentages were much lower, 20-25%. And this could be an issue with how you define marketing ROI. But nonetheless, this is the patches of sun, if you will, in some of our findings. Who were these organizations, or what were they? They were large, I don't think you have a surprise there, but they were also service organizations. Service organizations, 50% were satisfied with the ability to measure marketing ROI versus 33% only for consumer products and 26% only for industrial products. How did they use it? Well, the ones who were satisfied, let me be clear, this last line is only for those who said they were satisfied. But the ones who were satisfied, nearly 60% actually used the marketing ROI in their decision making. Finally, what were the problems with marketing ROI? Again, you can see these in other studies that have been conducted in the last 10 years. Just understanding what marketing ROI is. And again, I don't fault individuals here, I fault, in fact, management for not communicating exactly what we mean by marketing ROI. As you can see, 37%, when we asked them directly, they gave no mention of financial outcomes. Return on investment, it's all financial. It may come from other things, but at the end of the day, that's a financial measure. In fact, 19% said, when we asked them directly, is financial impact, has anything to do with ROI? They said no. They said no. And again, to me, this is obviously a very simple and fixable problem for getting more work on marketing ROI. Actually, we had some open-ended questions here, and some of the interesting responses were things like, good question, or we think we're spitting in the wind, and my favorite, ROI is whatever makes my boss happy. Finally, here's the news for how you do change things if you want to. Incentives, we found, had a huge, huge impact on whether companies were satisfied or not with the ability to measure marketing ROI. First of all, for your employees, paying them. The satisfied companies, more than 3 times as many, had some form of compensation system for including marketing ROI in the work their people were doing, 63%. For vendors, for people, marketing research, ad agencies, and so forth, it was setting clear objectives. And once again, the companies that were satisfied 4 times as likely to have set very clear objectives for their vendors in terms of business objectives. Other things that we found were associated with being satisfied with measuring marketing ROI was just setting any kind of measurable objective and also using objectives of any kind, using metrics of any sort. Metrics of any sort seem to create a climate, whether they're audience metrics, financial metrics, channel management metrics, anything, just creating a climate of measurability we found was highly associated with whether an organization was satisfied with the ability to measure marketing ROI. Finally, though, the key thing above all here is you got to start working on it. And hopefully everybody in this room is with a company or an organization that's been working on marketing ROI for a while. The relationship to time is one of the strongest relationships in all of these studies. 64% of those who've been working for at least 5 years, again, were satisfied with their ability to measure marketing ROI. In a study I did for the Conference Board, of all the things we looked at, the only one that was statistically significant was the time people had spent working on marketing ROI. Almost nothing else, culture, data, was as significant as just putting in the time, because as you put in the time, as you all know, the data gets better, the culture gets better, the incentives get better, things get more clear. And sometimes I run into situations where, for whatever reason, companies are holding back on jumping into this. It's not going to be perfect. It takes a while. Finally, my last slide, and I'll turn this over to Randall. Putting all this together, the findings in as broad a way as we might. First, set your business objectives. Secondly, whatever those objectives are, design the metrics for those. Those of you especially in social media, you know it's not just having social media, but what do you want to do with it? So the question is, what do you want to do with it? Then how do you measure it? Then buy the data that allow you to figure that out. And then finally, communicate it to everyone in the organization. And finally, actually reward people based on this. This is also, I think, Management 101, but it's also Marketing 101, Marketing ROI 101, and Branding 101.